Welcome to the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. The center was established by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States in January of 2024. Its purpose is to foster the study of Baha'i history, Baha'i sacred texts, Baha'i philosophical and theological concepts, and world religions from a Baha'i and comparative perspective. I am Robert Stock, director of the center. Joining me today is Borovicka, a freelance author, educator, and artist. She has a master's degree in education, and one of her books, her most recent book, is Light of the Kingdom, Biblical Topics in the Bahá'í Writings, Baha'i Publishing Trust 2016. Actually, you have a more recent book out than that, come to think of it, but that's your second most recent book. It's the fruit of over 15 years of research, action research that she carried out while designing and facilitating Baha'i Bible study workshops for Baha'is and their friends in the southern United States. She has regularly participated in the Erfan Colloquium, and her contributions to Lights of Erfan publications can be found at Baha'iLibrary.com and probably also at erfancolloquium.com as well, since they have a lot of the volumes up there. JoAnn has recently retired from a career in performance art, where she worked primarily through the South Carolina Arts Commission as an artist in residence in visual art and storytelling. She resides in Greenville, South Carolina, with her husband Mike and a miniature schnauzer named Juniper, where she enjoys creating unexpected artwork from her home studio. And I should add that JoAnn and I will be the co-faculty for the course Jesus and the Gospels in Comparative Perspective, which starts on September the 4th through the Corinne True Center for Baha'i History. So, welcome, JoAnn. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're delighted that you've been able to make it, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. So I will get your slideshow up, and I will bow out and turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Okay, so the title of this is Myth or Fact? What can we assume when the central figures of the Baha'i faith cite ancient traditions? And this will include ancient biblical traditions. So I first became curious about this when I was researching for the book Light of the Kingdom, which is a compilation, essentially, of biblical topics in the Baha'i Writings. And many things got my attention. For example, when Baha'u'llah in the Epistle to the Son of the Wolf says, "Anticipate ye the revelation of him who conversed with Moses from the burning bush on Sinai." Now, knowing Baha'u'llah's authority, I might think, was there really a burning bush on Sinai? "Thine iniquity hath made Gabriel to groan." Is there really an archangel named Gabriel? John, Luke, Mark, and Matthew, these four wrote after Christ what they remembered of his utterances. A statement from Baha'u'llah. Now, if you're familiar with biblical scholarship, you know that there is no agreement on the names of who wrote those Gospels, and there is no declaration of writer in those Gospels, no declaration of authorship. And so I thought, well, does that mean that someone named John, Luke, Mark, and Matthew, that these four wrote those Gospels? That's what Baha'u'llah said. And other statements, like from Abdu'l-Bahá, he says, "Remember how Adam and Eve and the others once dwelt together in Eden? No sooner, however, did a quarrel break out between Adam and Satan than they were one and all banished from the garden." And so he continues, Abdu'l-Bahá talks about the Garden of Eden story as if it really happened, which was very interesting because in other writings, he explains the symbolism of these, of the different characters and the garden itself. So I was looking for some kind of guidance about how to understand these passages. Now, we had, of course, for Baha'is, we know that the writings of the central figures have absolute authority. And this, on behalf of the Guardian, we cannot be sure how much or how little of the four Gospels are accurate and include the words of Christ and his undiluted teachings. All we can be sure of as Baha'is is that what has been quoted by Baha'u'llah and the Master must be absolutely authentic. So here's the question. Is it literally authentic, reliable, historically valid? Or does it mean that it is spiritually authentic, that the story cited is worthy material for a spiritual lesson? To what degree can we take the commentary on ancient traditions from the central figures and create historically valid claims from them? Okay, so what this presentation concludes, what I found, what I believe I found, and what I would propose is that this authenticity is a spiritual authenticity, that when the central figures cite ancient traditions and characters and stories, what is cited is worthy material for a spiritual lesson. Doesn't mean that it literally happened. And so I will share with you some authoritative guidance to that effect. This really gets right to the point. From Abdu'l-Bahá. When certain matters are actually myths, the divine manifestations bring them out as though they were real and elucidate them. For if they were to deny well-known and established matters, others would consider this evidence of their ignorance, and therefore they elucidate them as though they were real. That's a powerful statement. It answers a lot of questions. Let me give you the context for that. There's a story you may or may not have heard of. It's called Companions of the Cave. Here's how it goes. Around 250 AD, 7 Christian youth of Ephesus, a city in modern-day Turkey, hid in a cave to escape Roman persecution. This was early in the Christian era. Now, Emperor Decius sealed the cave, the story goes. And so the youth were locked inside. But they emerged 300 years later to a Christianized land. The church proclaimed their appearance a miracle and created the holy day of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, which is July 7th or 27th, depending on where you are. And it became a thing, this miracle. It's also one of the topics in the Quran, in Surah 18, entitled The Cave. Abdu'l-Bahá explains why this is addressed in the Quran, why Muhammad addressed the story of the companions of the cave. He says, in the days of the Prophet, the Jews prompted the Quraysh to ask about the people of the cave. Because the Prophet knew that this was just a myth, he was not inclined to give an answer, nor did he wish to say outright, it is a myth, nor did he want to say something that is not real. When he saw that his enemies would not stay their hand, he answered them as though it were real. And what did he say? Surah 18, verse 13. We shall tell you their story as it really was. Sounds like it really happened. In this chapter, Muhammad goes on to say how many youth were in the cave, because there was a discrepancy. Were there 5 or were there 7 and whatever? How long were they in the cave? Was it 300 years or 309 years? Muhammad added a dog to the story, so now we have a dog in the cave. Yes. So, and the whole time we have this presentation as if it is a real historical happening. And so to come back to Abdu'l-Bahá's statement, why did Muhammad do that? And notice in this explanation, he speaks of the divine manifestations. So this is not just limited to Muhammad, the prophet, but to all the divine manifestations. Abdu'l-Bahá states, again, when certain matters are actually myths, the divine manifestations bring them out as though they were real and elucidate them. For if they were to deny well-known and established matters, others would consider this evidence of their ignorance. Therefore, they elucidate them as though they were real. Now, we have other guidance as well. In the Kitabi Khan, Baha'u'llah makes the statement, "How can I relate all that befell him after he spoke these words? How shall I describe their heinous behavior toward him? They at last leaped on his blessed person such woes that he took his flight unto the fourth heaven." So now Jesus is taking a flight to the fourth heaven. How are we to understand this? In Baha'i cosmology, we don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, however many heavens. So their question was put forth. Let's see. And to the House of Justice about this fourth heaven. What is it? Where did this come from? And the research department responds, "As to the ascent of Christ to the fourth heaven, as revealed in the glorious book of the Icon, he, the guardian, stated that the fourth heaven is a term used and a belief held by the early astronomers. The followers of the Shia sect likewise held this belief. As the Kitabi Khan was revealed for the guidance of that sect, this term was used in conformity with the concepts of its followers." Okay, so again, we have this authoritative guidance on that the central figures may cite a early tradition as if it was true, and this is for purposes of a spiritual lesson, and to use language that's agreeable to those who are being taught, to take what they already think they know and to build on it. Okay, another example. This is about the 12th Imam and the Bab's commentary on the Surah of Joseph, the Qayyum al-Azma. So Baha'u'llah states, "It is known to thee that the commentary on the Surah of Joseph hath been revealed according to the prevailing understanding of the people at that time." What does that mean? A little bit of background. The original imams of Shia Islam were descendants of the Prophet, and they were important figures. Most were sons of the previous imams. All of them died of unnatural causes, poisonings and the likes, okay, except for the 12th imam, who, according to the doctrine of the occultation, disappeared in infancy in 255 AH, that's 878 Common Era, and remained in hiding. Okay, so this is the 12th Imam as an infant, remained in hiding. The 12th Imam was said to manage the affairs of the Muslim community through, or the Shia community, through special representatives called agents or deputies or emissaries or gates, babs. So these were individuals that claimed to know where the 12th Imam was and to be like the person who goes back and forth delivering messages and managing the community. It's a position full of authority. Okay, now the titles of the 12th Imam include Remnant of God, the rightly guided, he who will rise, and the hidden Imam. The expectation was the 12th Imam, the remnant of God, would come out of occultation in the end times with Jesus Christ and establish justice. Okay. So in the Bab's Qayyum al-Azma, he claims to be an agent of the 12th Imam. He states, I've been made the bearer of irrefutable proofs from the presence of him who is the long-expected remnant of God, one of the titles of the 12th Imam. And then he also claims to be the 12th Imam himself. This remembrance is indeed the glorious remnant of the light of God. So what is he? Is he the emissary? Is he the 12th Imam? So it's seemingly contradictory because in the Baha'i faith, we recognize the Bab as a manifestation of God. He's more than the 12th Imam. So in the person of the Bab, every follower of Baha'u'llah recognizes not merely an inspired annunciator, but a direct manifestation of God. And so we have the twin manifestations, the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So why is he claiming to be an emissary to the hidden Imam? And why is he claiming to be the hidden Imam? And we go back to Baha'u'llah's explanation. It is known to thee that the commentary on the Surah of Joseph hath been revealed according to the prevailing understanding of the people at that time. And so the dynamic you could compare to a teacher who is speaking to his or her students in language that they understand and touching a familiar chord as he begins or she begins to build on the lesson. Okay. So this is a phenomenon. And continuing, Baha'u'llah states, this hath been due to pure bounty. Haply the wayward and ignorant people may become transported to the realm of knowledge, because much of that which hath been stated therein are the material known to be truth with the people of the Quran. Okay, so people knew that there was a hidden 12th Imam. Was there? I don't know. But they felt they knew that was a fact. So you start with that knowledge, and in that way, the Bab sort of gradually made claim and then a greater claim and building up to his final claim. Another source here, we have the story of the Exodus. Now, the Exodus, of course, is a very important story in Western civilization, and there's much discussion about it. And finding sources outside the Bible that verify the historical happenings of the Exodus, with no question, is not something that's really happened yet. Okay, so there were inquiries about that. And Abdu'l-Bahá was also going to be using the Exodus in a commentary, but he prefaced it with this, I want to call it a disclaimer. He says, the events that transpired at the advent of the prophets of the past and their ways and works and circumstances are not adequately set down in authoritative histories and are referred to only in condensed form in the verses of the Quran, the holy traditions, and the Torah. He continues, To preclude once and for all objections on the part of any of the world's peoples, we shall conduct our discussion about the Exodus conformably to those authoritative accounts which all nations are agreed upon. And at that time, the general agreement was that the Exodus was a historical fact, the manner in which it appeared in Exodus. Okay, another example. This is related to the story of Lot and his daughters that comes to us from the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, this from the research department. Abdu'l-Bahá states that the story of Lot and his daughters and the apostasy of some of the prophets recorded in the Torah and the Psalms are confused dreams that, quote, are the words of historians among the people of the book, for which God hath revealed no authority. Okay, so he specifically says that the story of Lot and his daughters, we're led to believe here that that is not historically accurate. But here was the question. An extract of a letter written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi, found in Lights of Guidance, states that according to the text of Genesis, Lot and his daughters are in Genesis. According to the text of Genesis, Lot bears no responsibility for the actions of his daughters. How could the guardian give legitimacy to the story in light of the statement made by Abdu'l-Bahá? Okay, so this person's asking, he's confused. Abdu'l-Bahá says it's not historically accurate. The guardian is stating Lot bears no responsibility for the actions of his daughters. Help me understand. Research department responds in a letter dated February 1944, written on behalf of Shoghi Effendi to an individual believer, we read, when Abdu'l-Bahá states we believe what is in the Bible, he means in substance. Not that we believe every word of it to be taken literally, or that every word is the authentic saying of the prophet. With this in mind, it would appear that in the letter to which Mr. refers, the guardian is commenting on the meaning of the story of Lot and his daughters as found in the Bible, irrespective of its authenticity or reliability, and that he is not maintaining that the text of Genesis 19 is to be understood literally. Okay, so even though the guardian referred to an ancient tradition as if it really occurred, this doesn't mean that we're to take it literally as a historical fact. Now, Mirza Abul Fazl has a long history with the faith. He was a very trusted person. That's who Abdu'l-Bahá sent to the United States to straighten out the early Baha'i community. And we have some treasures of his writings, and he addresses this very straightforwardly. He says, it is clear that the prophets and manifestations of the cause of God were sent to guide the nations, to improve their characters, and to bring the people nearer to their source and ultimate goal. They were not sent as historians, astronomers, philosophers, or natural scientists. Their position in the world of creation is like that of the heart in the body. It has a universal position with a general effect. Therefore, the prophets have indulged the people in regard to their historical notions, folk stories, and scientific principles, and have spoken to them according to these. They conversed as was appropriate to their audience and hid certain realities behind the curtain of illusion. So this explanation is so clear. This was actually the first piece I came upon that directly addressed this issue, but because Mirza Abul Fazl is not a central figure, I went hunting for more authoritative guidance. But he certainly has a beautiful way of putting this. He continues, finally, it is well known that neither the Prophet Muhammad nor the rest of the prophets ever engaged in disputes with the people about their historical beliefs, but addressed them according to their local traditions. So this reminds me, there's a tablet in which Abdu'l-Bahá states, what language should he who is the mouthpiece of God choose to speak, so that they who are shut out as by a veil from him can recognize his glory? And it would appear that one of the languages is to speak in terms of traditional knowledge. There's also poetry. There's all kinds of different languages that the manifestation of God speaks in his spiritual instruction. One language is the use of traditional understandings and mythological stories, and they may speak in them, sort of enter the traditional discourse and make it sound as if those things really occurred. So then the question is, how can we tell if stories cited are myths or are they facts? Because they could well also be historically true. So how do we know that? Or maybe is that the wrong question if we're talking about the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá? In the Tabernacle of Unity, Manakji Sahib asked many questions that were of the this or that nature. Is it this or is it that? Which of the ancient prophets and creeds are most acceptable to God? Of all the views on the nature of God and his messengers, which is correct? Which religion observes the most appropriate dietary law? What of the various religions' understanding of creation is correct? Okay, so he just, one after another, questions about, is it this or is it that? Which one is historically correct? Baha'u'llah's statement is very telling, his response. His response to all the questions was, the remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. So he didn't go back and, as a historian, correct information, or as a theologian, engage fully in what Manakji Sahib wanted him to do. This was the overall answer. And when the questioner was reluctant to take that answer, he said, really, this is all you need to know. So what I'd like to conclude is that our immediate task in reading the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá and the Bab is not to try to figure out whether the story they might cite is historically accurate, but to hear the spiritual lesson that directs us to the remedy required for the age we live in, and to apply that lesson to the exigencies and requirements of our time. So we just have to be satisfied with the fact that the manifestations of God and Abdu'l-Bahá are not historians. That's not why they came. Okay, so what can we assume when the central figures of the Baha'i faith cite ancient traditions? We can assume that the story cited is worthy material for a spiritual lesson. We cannot assume that it is historical fact. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much. I love that that conclusion, JoAnn, because it really resonates with so many other things that we hear about, other manifestations. For example, people kept asking the Buddha. They tend to ask the Buddha all kinds of very specific questions that he didn't want to answer. And I think at one point some man asked him when the universe began or when it was going to end, and he said that reminds him of the story of the man who was shot with an arrow, and he's laying on the ground bleeding, and his friend runs up to him and says, "Quick, we've got to get you to a doctor. We've got to get this arrow out of you." And the man says, "No, no, 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 no. First, I want to know who shot me. How far away was he? How big was his bow and arrow? Why did he shoot me?" And these, of course, are irrelevant questions when you're bleeding to death. So this was the response of the Buddha, in a very similar kind of a situation. The other thing that occurs to me is that this is very relevant when we read the writings and we see Baha'u'llah using terms that in the 21st century we would consider inappropriate, like the term savage, for example, which is the kind of thing you could use in the 19th century because it was widely used and they didn't have other terms that we have today. And in fact, frequently, whenever the majority starts to refer to a minority group and they other that group, whatever that term is for the other group tends to become a dirty word. It tends to become an insult. And then you have to come up with another name for that group. And it tends also to become an insult. You can even think of terms not just with minority groups, but back in the 19th and early 20th centuries when they were beginning to rank people's intelligence and developing IQ tests.
Oh, wow.
They were inventing terms from Greek like moron, for example, which today you just can't use that to refer to people. But in those days, they invented that term because they needed a new word. So they were inventing these terms to try and classify people by IQ. And of course, these terms now are just not acceptable. And this shows you the problem that language evolves as people use it. And so we're always going to be dealing with a scriptural language that's using terms that are a little out of date. And we have to, therefore, kind of translate whenever we read these things.
Thank you.
We have several people already, quite a few comments here about how marvelous this talk was, and I fully agree. Where did you get these terms? Did Will McCants point out some of these passages to you and then translate them, or did you hear about them from other people and approach Will to provide the translations?
Okay, well, let me return to the one that I started with, which was quite an adventure, I can tell you. Okay, yeah. When certain matters are actually missed, the divine manifestations bring them out as though they were real. Yeah, I was in the throes of desperately searching for authoritative guidance to this effect. I mean, it seemed logical, but it's like, where's the authoritative guidance? And I was teaching a course with you and Ted. And actually, Rob, you entered this and said that a participant from another course had entered this in the forum discussion. Yeah, and that
what if that was
exactly. And so you had the reference, but what I didn't know was who translated it. Okay, so the Khalq is widely available to Persian readers.
Yep.
This is an important collection, very authoritative. I mean, it's authoritative, important collection. It's in Persian, but it has not been officially translated into English yet. So it's not available to English speakers. Readily available to English speakers. Okay, so I had the quote, I had the reference, but I didn't have an authoritative quotation, authoritative translation, right? And so I went looking for somebody who was the best translator, and I happen to know Will McCant's
Mhm.
sister, Marcia, and I inquired, and through the grapevine, he was generous enough to retranslate the whole thing, which said the same. It said the same thing, but he refined it. And so there it is. That's the story of where that came from, and you were part of the solution.
That's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know where I have no idea where I heard it, but I pick these things up frequently on various listservs and that I'm on, and then sometimes I try to save them and remember them and quote them somewhere else. But
Mhm.
you've, I think, put together the best compilation of these quotations that anyone has ever put together.
Well, I was looking for authority.
Yeah,
Like
it really is very helpful. And I
Mm.
gather this particular presentation, since you've given a version of it before, it
Mhm.
has continued to evolve as you've been
Mhm.
getting more details and have been able to find new ways of looking at the same question, new angles
Right.
to
And I
look
think
at.
it's an important concept to understand because if we get hung up on, well, Baha'u'llah referred to Abraham and his nephew, so therefore there was a man named Abraham and he had a nephew and that was his name and that was Abraham and this thing happened, or any of the ancient traditions, surely something happened. But if we hold on to them tight, like, oh, this has to be historically true, and if we conflate authority with literal historical fact, we have to understand that we can't do that when
Yeah,
they're citing ancient traditions. And it's not the point. The point is the message. How is that being used for the spiritual message? What is the message and how is it relevant today?
yeah. And Mirza Abul Fazl again has another comment about that. He talks about how when people insist on a literal understanding of things, somewhere else in one of his books I read 30 years ago, that this can turn off the thinking people, the people who are concerned about rational consistency, and
Mhm,
this causes them to turn away from religion.
mhm,
So
right,
this kind of understanding, this kind of nuanced understanding, which allows us to enjoy, appreciate, and benefit from the contents of the ancient scriptures without worrying about the historical validity of them,
mhm, that's right.
is
And the
very
way
important.
the central figures honor the ancient traditions is something that we really need to emulate. I
Yeah,
mean, when I first read the Kitabi Khan, it was exciting to me that Baha'u'llah was talking about Abraham and Moses. He was talking about Joseph. He was talking about these figures that were familiar to me as a lover of the Bible.
right.
And it's and it's important to know that that's for larger understandings.
Yeah, the other place this resonates with me, I should mention, is Bart Ehrman's book on the New Testament that we're going to be using as with your text on Light of the Kingdom, the
I
two
agree.
textbooks for the course.
Hmm.
And Ehrman points out that in the first century AD, the way history was not written the way we write history today.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is because it was a largely illiterate society. There were, of course, no printing presses, so things had to be hand copied. And a papyrus was expensive and hard to make. Very few people could really read and write very well. And the result is that whenever anybody wanted to write a biography, they were largely dependent on oral tradition. Even if they were writing about Alexander the Great or about a Roman emperor, with some of these great people, they might indeed have some written sources. They might occasionally have some letters that were written at that time, but they wouldn't have had any, obviously, newspapers. They wouldn't have had any journalism. They wouldn't have had birth certificates or marriage certificates. None of those kinds of documents were available. And the result is that the ancient biographers were very much dependent upon the techniques of storytelling in order to write their biographies. And that meant, for example, inventing long speeches in the mouths of their characters, because this was one way they could present the characters' understanding of the world and their approach to things, what they were going to do on the eve of a big battle. I can remember when I was 15 reading Thucydides, and the Peloponnesian Wars. Yes, I did read it when I was 15,
Mhm.
being very skeptical about these long speeches in the mouth of Pericles and various other characters. I don't remember whose speeches they were anymore, but I remember thinking, how could they possibly know these long speeches? But of course they didn't. This was just the technique. And that's the technique you see in the Gospel of John towards the end, where you have these two speeches of Jesus. It's the technique you see with Paul's Areopagus speech in Athens to the unknown God. And you see it again and again and again. And in the case of Paul's speeches in Acts, you can compare them to the ideas in his genuine letters, and they sometimes contradict his comments in his genuine letters. So it's really fascinating that we can unpack this understanding of the world from the first century, and it very much resonates with what Baha'u'llah describes. I can remember I once had to read The Golden Ass by Apuleius, which is sort of a novel. And it's about a man who's converted into a donkey, and then the gods appear, and the gods are changing people, and all these kinds of supernatural events are part of the novel. And of course, as again Ehrman points out, there's no conception of the natural and the supernatural being separated in the ancient world. This is a pre-scientific world. And its pre-scientific world views the natural and the supernatural as all being kind of mixed together. So we're just not used to thinking that way because of Galileo and the other people who discovered that you could indeed measure things very, very precisely, and you could create scientific theories and prove them. Aristotle did not do that kind of science. They didn't know how to.
Right.
Anyway, I'm going on and on and on. Bill asks, is McCants' translation of the passage for Amr va Khalq available online or anywhere in English? Because he'd like to cite it. Is it in any of your publications, for example?
It is not in Light of the Kingdom. I wish it was. It's not in Light of the Kingdom because I hadn't found it yet.
Right.
It is in the paper that's related to this presentation, which has been approved by the review committee of National Spiritual Assembly of the United States. So that paper is expected to be published soon by Lights of Irfan. However, it's also published in this presentation.
Right.
Right. So, and if you want to email me, I can just send you an electronic copy of it. So,
well, if with your permission, also we can put the PowerPoint up on the Corinne True Center's webpage.
Yeah,
people will be able to pull it off of there as well.
Right.
So we'll be glad to do that, of course. Bill, of course, has also written quite a bit on the subject of myth himself. Something to clarify is that a myth is not necessarily historically or literally true, but a myth has spiritual meaning, and that is educative and inspiring. I think he wrote that before you had completely given your comments, which of course reinforced exactly that point. And in that sense, myths aren't necessarily false, but nor are they necessarily historically true.
That's right.
One of the things that we have a tendency in our society is to look at ancient, the Bible and other ancient documents, and to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, to reject the whole thing on the grounds that, we don't even know whether Jesus lived, for example. We don't know whether Moses lived. I think we can safely say we know Jesus lived. Moses, I've always been inclined to think he lived, but I admit that the reconstructing the historical Moses is probably a daunting task that may no longer be possible. We can certainly report the stories, but it'd be hard to go beyond that. With Jesus, there's of course a whole effort by people to reconstruct the historical Jesus from the New Testaments, which is quite a controversial effort. I knew some of the people in the Historical Jesus seminar, and they would debate a particular statement in perhaps several of the Gospels and various other early Christian literature about and whether they thought it was authentic or not. They have a whole seminar about, for a weekend about the authenticity of the statement, and in the end they would vote on whether they felt it was historic or not.
Oh my gosh.
I'm sure they did that partly to tweak the noses of the fundamentalists.
To vote. Oh my God.
They would use a black pebble for a no, a red pebble for yes, and then maybe a pink and a gray pebble for maybe.
And that's so we established the historicity. That is incredible. No, I believe that mythology has more truth than historical fact. Mythology has greater truth because mythology is always true. The truths that are carried in a mythological story are always relevant. They're axioms in a story. They're always true. So the Exodus is always going to be true. The point of the Exodus, the many meanings of the Exodus will always be true. It'll always be relevant. And so mythology is larger than just something happened at one point in time. It has greater applicability, and it's used a lot in the central figures' commentaries. Yeah.
Yep, that's very true. And they, of course, were very good with just using stories. And sometimes the stories they used were 18th and 19th century or medieval stereotypes about groups of people.
Yeah.
Which, of course, nowadays we wouldn't want to use as a story.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, it was an acceptable technique. And so they used those kinds of stories to make a point, which really may have nothing to do with those particular people. They talk about a people in India who are vegetarians and are very strong and are good warriors. Presumably they're talking about the Sikhs. And then don't smoke. And they talk about this as a reason why you shouldn't smoke. And of course, so they're using a story in that case to make a different point. Bill also notes that he remembers a speaker at one point quoting a letter from Shoghi Effendi dating 24 December. And he says it was on the eve of Christ's birth. The Guardian says that in his letter. And so this particular person insisted that Jesus was indeed born on the 25th of December. I've heard a Hand of the Cause of God say exactly that. And that, of course, is indeed a very literal way of reading that text.
Sure. Or just entering the traditional discourse.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a better way of putting it. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of people know what that means. It holds meaning, fewest number of words. Why not?
Yeah. Marco says, in my experience, upholding the spiritual integrity of the Bible instead of its historical integrity is helpful in establishing bridges.
Now see, isn't that important? That is so important. Thank you, Marco. Yeah, for building community, establishing bridges. It's not about whether something happened or not. There have been many arguments in the Christian community for a millennium about what happened or who was this person or who was that person, and all the arguments. And to just rise above all that and look for the spiritual meaning in the verses is really unifying. Yeah. Thanks, Marco.
Even the basic things, each gospel. I mean, the Christian community has never been unanimous that Mark was written by Mark, or Matthew was written by Matthew, or Luke was written by Luke, or John was written by John. From the very beginning, there were questions about this because the earliest manuscripts have no names attached to them.
That's right.
So this has always been an issue that's been discussed. Marco says it's a way to show that we not merely respect Christianity, we uphold its divine source and spiritual teachings.
That's a connection.
Yep. What has been your experience with all these classes that you were offering on the Bible for the last 15 or 20 years? What approaches did you find were particularly useful?
Oh my gosh. I just learned so much. What can I say? The one of the things one of the things that people often cried about actually was when they would study the Station of Jesus from the Bahá'í Writings, and then also the Station of Baha'u'llah. And when they would get it in their hearts that Baha'u'llah is the fulfillment of Christ, it took away a lot of fear and anxiety. Sometimes I learned, sometimes people would come to the Baha'i faith after having a really bad experience in a Christian church for a long time and like throw all that away. I want to do something else. Come to the Baha'is where you're welcome and they're part of the Baha'i community. But in their heart, they felt like they had left Jesus.
Yeah.
And they loved Jesus. Their problem was with everything else. But they loved Jesus. And so there was this guilt and kind of a childlike mourning for the Jesus they knew when they were a little boy or girl. And when they discovered the spiritual connection between Jesus the Christ and Baha'u'llah, they often it would just happen in a moment and they would just be sobbing for joy, really, that really Christ, the Spirit of Christ was still with them, and they knew Christ through Baha'u'llah, and it was, and everything that Christ said he would do, he did, and that was very exciting. So these mystical realities had a real big effect on a lot of people.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it reinforced the positive in Christianity as well after their negative experiences. And that is so important because the faith never wants to tear down another religion or beliefs in a messenger of God. We always want to reinforce it.
That's right.
And we don't want people to say, oh, I can become a Baha'i and chuck Christianity, because you can't chuck Christianity. It's there. It's
anything.
It may be truth, wrapped up in human thought in many ways. And in some ways, the Baha'i writings help to clarify that. But you can't reject and give up on the previous faiths.
That's right. Another element was that Baha'is who were not familiar with the Bible, which many people, Christian or Baha'i or whatever, today are not. People aren't as biblically literate as they used to be. If they would be confronted with, say, Christian friends who were accusing them of following the Antichrist, and it would make them mad, and they had a hard time responding in a positive manner to these accusations. And so in studying the epistles of, John 1, 2, 3, and understanding exactly what the Bible says about the antichrists at the time that that epistle was written, what they were, how they were working against the Christian community, some people's understanding of how it should be at that time. And they understood more from a biblical perspective what that term means, as opposed to a Hollywood version of this spectacular Antichrist creature person. Anyway, they would be very relieved, because then they had knowledge and they could speak from biblical authority about what an Antichrist was and the criteria for that, and then talk about the lives and teachings of and mission of Baha'u'llah and show that it wasn't that. It had nothing to do with that. So they could speak. I think it's important to be able to speak from the original text. So if
Mhm.
Antichrist is introduced in the epistles, let's understand that context and what that means.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's empowering.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Bill also comments how he sees many atheists dismiss the Bible precisely because of the confusion about scriptural stories being literally and historically true. And this indeed is a problem today. And for that matter, without anyone able to provide an authoritative interpretation in Christianity, or the Pope can for Catholics, of course, but even today, Catholics don't always listen to the Pope. And this, of course, even causes even more confusion because of the diversity of understandings that what Christianity is that flows from all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Do unto Caesar what you need to do unto Caesar, and do unto God that which is God's, has been taken to mean we can ignore the government's actions. We don't have to be worried about whether it's ethical or not, which is not presumably the point.
Right.
All kinds of statements about the sword made by Jesus can be understood to endorse holy war, or at least allow the use of violence, when other statements of Jesus seem clearly to state that you can't.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to bring all of these different perspectives together, as Shoghi Effendi says, two comments in the Baha'i writings may appear to be poles apart, but they're on a surface of a sphere that connects them together.
Mm-hmm.
And what is often missing in modern Christianity is a sense of the sphere.
Mm-hmm.
So these different perspectives not the connection between them. That we're back. I disappeared for a minute.
You
Did I
did.
disappear for a minute? Yeah. My internet may have done that. Glenn says, someone told me when I was investigating the Baha'i faith, reconciling the claims of Baha'u'llah with my knowledge of Christ, that I must learn to separate churchianity from Christianity.
Wasn't that good advice?
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. So there's a difference between the Spirit of Christ and his teachings and the what the Baha'i faith understands to be the spirit of Christianity.
Yeah, and speaking of this comment I make about the poles apart in the sphere, to some extent, for Baha'is, the Baha'i writings provide that spherical surface that help tie seemingly opposite comments in the Gospels together.
I agree.
Also, and then so that's another factor for the reason we sometimes have a different view of Christianity compared to different Christian groups.
Mm-hmm. It really, our Baha'i principles really take us above the argument.
Yeah, I think that's
where we can find agreement.
And of course, not only do they take us above the argument, but it also tells us not to get involved in arguments
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we can, so that we don't cause disunity by raising the emotional temperature of the subject.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's, I think, some really interesting comments we've had from various readers.
Yeah, thank you.
And so that's been quite helpful. I don't see any other comments right offhand, and I can't think of anything to add other than, I want to again encourage people to consider the course that we'll be starting in a couple of weeks, where we will be looking at Bart Ehrman's Introduction to the New Testament, and we'll be looking at JoAnn's book, The Light of the Kingdom, together, so that we can compare Baha'i scriptural comments about various texts with some of the historical understandings and the theories. Let's face it, a lot of this is theory, and also the techniques, biblical study techniques that are being used, so that we can get some sense of the approach that scholars are taking. And I don't think at this point we can say that there's a smooth integration of the Baha'i and scholarly perspectives.
That's because the scholarly perspective is necessarily historical.
Ah.
And the Baha'i perspective is spiritual.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, so in one way to think of it is that the Baha'i perspective accommodates really any changes in the historical perspectives, because what it focuses in on is the spiritual message.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a very, very good way of looking at the topic, and I appreciate you reminding me of that, because I'm very good at getting into the minutiae of the history, having studied it from that point of view.
Yeah.
So,
well, independent investigation of truth. We can examine that history and appreciate all the examinations and learn and grow our knowledge about that time and those writings, and yay.
mm-hmm.
And at the same time, none of that can really waver our faith in Jesus Christ or Baha'u'llah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Someone just asked for your email address.
Yeah, I've tried to get into the chat, but it says connect to my email account. To do that,
I can probably put it in there, though I don't have it immediately. I don't have immediate access to your email.
Okay, well,
if nothing else, they can just simply write to the Korean Truth Center and we can forward emails to you. Also, once this is up on YouTube, you'll be able to post a comment on YouTube, and we can respond to those comments there as well.
Right. My email address, I don't mind giving it out. It's JoAnn Borovicka, just as it's spelled with no spaces, @gmail.com.
Yeah,
So
and it's written in green right there on your screen, so it's easy for people to see.
Yeah.
Well, I don't
pronounce.
Yes. And that's helpful as well, to have the pronunciation, actually. I just want to get one more thing here. So I've got it. I think that's everything we've got today. So Thank you from the Korean Truth Center for Baha'i Studies, Baha'i History Today. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Next week, we will have Peter Terry talking about religion in general and sort of the Baha'i approach to religion and religions. So until then, we hope you have a good week, and goodbye for now. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, everyone.